Hi.
This meeting is being recorded.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today evening. I know it's a working day, and I'm sure all of you have had a long day, especially coming back from the holidays. Firstly, best wishes for 2022 to all of you. We hope that this year, at least, COVID will dissipate, hopefully, by the end of this year, at least, and give us all some respite. But anyway, I'm really excited to have a very interesting speaker today and talking about a very, very interesting topic. In fact, a couple of days back, McKinsey released a study talking about um, how consumer behavior has changed during COVID. And interestingly, about 75% of consumers they interviewed said that they've actually tried a new way of buying a product during COVID. Right now, that was expected, right? Because a lot of people had to buy products online, etc. But what's happened as a result of the last, almost 24 months now is that another 72% said that they expected brands that they've started buying products with, maybe in a digital ecosystem, to know who they are and therefore start personalizing the experience for them. But what was more interesting in that study was a third data point where customers said that 75 of those who expected personalization said that they would actually feel frustrated and disappointed if they did not get a personalized experience. I think if anybody, for all of you who have used digital products and services, for example, if you're buying stuff on Flipkart or Amazon, etc., you do expect after maybe 3 or 4 years of buying products that the platform does understand you. The platform doesn't show you things that potentially you're not interested in, etc. And I think all of us as consumers are starting to expect a greater amount of personalization in every brand or service experience we have. But what's interesting also is how data privacy is changing. The Indian Personal Data Protection Act is currently in Parliament. Uh, Hopefully, it will be potentially passed as a regulation over the next 12 to 14 months, which means that if not in 2022, in 2023 for sure, India will have some form of data privacy and data protection regulation, right? And there's equal amount of pressure on the government as well to make this happen, given the large amount of incidences that are happening in terms of data privacy being violated or platforms losing customer data, which is of a personal nature. And as a result of this, I think marketers are going to be faced with this very interesting and very painful conundrum, right? On one hand, consumers are demanding more and more personalization, right? Whether I go to an OTT platform, whether I go to a payment app, whether I go to an e-commerce site, whether I go to a site where I buy groceries, I expect that after 4 or 5 purchases, that platform knows who I am and understands what I need, understands what payment methods I prefer, understands which addresses I need to get delivered to, etc., etc. And on the other hand, the same consumer uh, is increasingly worried about the fact that their data is potentially being abused by platforms, because the unfortunate truth is that many platforms out there are misusing consumer data. So I think when we talk to Sanup, and Sanup, has the rich experience uh, in digital marketing across several countries. Now he's based out of Berlin, and is the global, marketing manager for DHL Express. But interestingly, he was in India for the break, and therefore we had the opportunity to have him as a speaker at a regular time. So without further ado, to talk about the privacy versus personalization conundrum, I'm going to hand over to Sanup. All yours, Sanup. Sorry, Sanup, you're on mute.
Sorry, I just realized that I was on mute. Happens. Sorry for that. I said I just switched the camera on so that you can all recognize me. And what I will do is I will share my screen, and then I'll go off the camera so that we can talk about the important part of this presentation. Just give me a minute. Hopefully you all can see my screen. If Anand, you can just confirm
Yes,
that I can just.
yes, we can. It's clear, absolutely clear.
Super. Right. Once again, thank you so much, Elif's team, to give me this opportunity, and thank you all to dial in today. I know you all must have had a busy day, and I hopefully can make this next 1 hour interesting, equally inspiring, and I'm hoping to learn at the same time from you guys, because at the end it's all about experience, isn't it? My personal experience is about privacy, and personalization is not going to be yours, or at the same time what is yours experience is not going to be my experience. So it'll be interesting to have your point of view as well, to understand how you think about these two particular subjects. And then I'm just looking forward to a lot of inspiring discussions to happen. But before I do that, let me wish all of you a wonderful and a happy 2022. And I hope this year brings a lot of happiness, safety, healthy year for you all. And with that being said, I will just give you a quick introduction about me to what Anand just mentioned. I currently head the global marketing, digital marketing and technology for DHL Express Global. I'm based off Dusseldorf in Germany. And obviously and DHL Express's headquarters is in Bonn, which is pretty much close to Dusseldorf. But what I personally am interested in, my experience and expertise is around digital and technology strategy, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And I've spent the last 3 or 4 years researching on blockchain and cryptocurrencies in marketing and advertising. That's another interesting topic in this era. But before we proceed, I hope that I am audible and clear to all of you. And my content is in the slide is clear and visible. And hopefully, and I'm sure we don't want any disturbance, I'm going to keep my phone on silent, and hopefully you all have done the same. So let's begin, right? So personalization and privacy. To me, it's the two sides of the same coin, right? And this Anand, as he mentioned about the conundrum, and it's actually correct. It's actually a big one in every part of the world. In European Union, it's a big topic since 2018 when the GDPR was introduced. And then the question is actually moved to US, and now with China, and a lot of other markets are getting into data regulations and all this thing. And privacy is becoming a lot more important. So the question here is, how do we have a proper balance? And I think that's where that's why it's a big conundrum, right? Because as an advertiser, or even as a let's say an online advertising platform, we all want to achieve our underlying economic aims, right? Ad tech industry did do this by cookies, and somewhere in a ethical manner, somewhere in a non-ethical manner, but whatever. In all of it, we were able to do a healthy amount of personalization until the cookies were alive. I mean, cookies would still alive, but by 2023, we see that Chrome also going out. We will not have that as well. Now, the question, the conundrum just extends. The questions just extends, because there's no one answer to this particular conundrum. Because even if the tech works and the industry can get some kind of consensus, there's always a good question: would this really be private? What about the competitors, right? Because it's just going to be more closed environment for everybody. And how do you kind of look what is your competition is doing, how do you can be competitive at the same time when the market is common for everybody? So it's like what I meant. The bottom line is this conundrum just extends day by day, and there's no one answer, or there's no one solution that fits to this problem. But there is solutions that coming up, and there is one framework, and there are many frameworks that's adopted and useful, which is what we will talk about it today. But what is also important to understand when you talk about personalization and privacy, it's about how do you approach this topic by keeping some principles as a brand, right? And at the same as if it's an agency partner or anybody. And if you follow those principles, right, in the minds and the eyes of the consumer, you feel you've been seen as a brand that is taken care of all these principles, and therefore you get the outcome of it. We'll look into that a little as we go ahead. But before that, and I'm sure it's going to be, but maybe Anand, you can help me out with the answers coming in the chat. What I want all of you to do is just answer yes or no in the chat. If, and I'm sure you may have come with this explicit consent on any website that you go. So do you give consent or you don't give consent?
If you guys could just respond
Zahid or-
with a yes or a no, that's it. You just go to the chat and say that.
Yeah.
So we have some no's, we have some few no's, but we have sometimes yes, mostly no. Okay. Some cases it
Great.
depends.
Super.
So if
Cool.
important,
Okay.
then yes, no. So good, interestingly. So I think we have a crowd which is not necessarily all yes. Some of them are yes, some of them are no. So good.
Right. Okay. And largely it is no. Is that
Sanup,
correct?
I think,
Because I'm not able to see the chat.
yeah. No, I think it's a mix of yes and no. I think so. Interestingly, I would say it's still about
Okay.
50-50. Yeah.
Okay, great. And just one more last question. Do you prefer seeing a personalized message or an offer from a brand? Again, answer yes or no from the audience chat. And I would hope a lot of it would be coming yes, because that's what I got from many of the other webinars that I did. But it'll be interesting to see what's here.
Yes, I think most people are saying yes, and sometimes a few no's. So I guess people who are really, really protective about their privacy would want a brand to be using it for whatever reason why. But yes, I think predominantly it's still yes, and of course, if it's on brands you're interested in, definitely yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So is the ratio a little higher than the privacy one? Can I say that? Or can you say that? Like maybe a 60-40 instead of 50-50?
Yeah, I would say 70-30 still on this. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. 70 yes?
It's almost yes. Yeah. But
Okay,
with
great.
caveats, I think so. Some people do have caveats about where they would like to see
Caveat.
personalization.
Okay, which is fair. Yeah, fair enough. But see, this is what I meant to say, right? Now, as a brand, you would see this as an opportunity that people would like personalized message. But as a brand, also sees a challenge on how to personalize when the data regulation or the data ethics are not allowing them to know who this person is, right? And so that's the balancing act the brand has to do, right? To be able to get that consensus from you. To some of you said depends, right? That depending factor depends upon how open the brand is in this consensual cookie banner, for example, or what exactly it states. I'm sure you may have seen a lot of websites just posting one line and asking the consent, right? As opposed to some websites where you have detailed and a split of cookies as to what these cookies are and what exactly this would do, right? Because I'm sure we don't have time to go through like a 10-page data privacy contract before you give the consent. Nobody would do that, right? So, but having equally important, because that's where the brand can have this balance of actually being able to personalize, but also being able to kind of make sure that your consensus are respected. So it's a good mix, because I saw pretty much the same ratio everywhere, where the people expect a personalized message, but they're quite hesitant to give the consent because and that's fair and it's justified. We'll see that why is it justified. But before we jump into that, what does the world look like when it comes to data privacy and protection everywhere, right? At the moment, and this is from the UNCTDA website, which basically looks into all the data protection and privacy legislation currently existing worldwide. At the moment, there are 69 countries with legislation, 10 countries with draft legislation. India falls into this. 16 countries with no legislation, and 5 countries with no data. So obviously, there cannot be a regulation when there is no sharing of data and all this stuff. Interestingly, for a longest time, um, China was held with countries with less data protection, because I'm sure you would have heard in China it's pretty easy to kind of transact through WeChat or WePay or Telegram or different kind of options, and there where the sharing of data is quite easy, right? But that's not the case now when the Chinese government has put a lot of restrictions in the last 1 year, and we can see even more stricter, even stricter than the GDPR legislation coming in China in the next 1 year. But that's how the countries are moving, right? Because everybody wants to kind of make sure that the data of the consumer or the data of the public for that matter is respected and is protected, rather than the brands using them for their own purposes. You could use this link and go in there, and they have a wonderful graphical representation of the world map, and where you can hover over your screen cursor and see the detailed split by split as to what regulation they have and what does it cover and what does it not cover. And this is where I guess Anand made a point about India's personal data protection bill currently in the parliament, and hopefully it will have an effect, a comprehensive effect, I think is the IAT 2000, right? So, and I don't think India had anything beyond that IAT 2000 till now, if the personal data protection comes in place. What I understood, I have not read the entire list of things in the personal data protection, but it has a lot of elements from the European Union GDPR, which, in my experience, is the strictest and stringent GDPR data protection policy so far existing in the world. There's so many limitations that has come into marketing and marketing deliverables, just making it difficult for the brands to kind of work on data. That being said, there are a lot of different ways of working around. This does not restrict to kind of share the data. What it tells is to basically share data use the data with more respect on the data protection. But it has impact into the number of data we had previously versus what we have now. We'll talk about that a little more in the few slides. But this is how it looks, right? This is how it used to be before any data protection regime. This is how it is once the data protection regime comes into play. This is how Europe, GDPR or CCPA in the US would affect the data collection processes as opposed to what it was before. But interestingly, even if the funnel here shows that there's less data, my experience says that that less data is actually quite beneficial to kind of create a parallel demographic, right? Because I'm sure a lot of people who are working in the digital space would understand what a lookalike audience modeling and all of these things is. What we get is a fair representation of the audience, right? Which in the past was not, because even if we had a bundle of data available, there were not data cleansing that was done. So there was a lot of duplication of data. But now we are working on data that is quite, let's say the quality is quite good, which gives a fair representation of data points that we can actually use to build audiences in, let's say, DLP or customer data platform. Sorry, was that a question or somebody's mic on? Okay, I'm hoping that was the mic on. But if there is any question, and if you want to stop me, feel free to do that. Yeah. But let's say along with the privacy thing, right? What tags along is the cookie crackdown by tech companies, right? And I'm sure many of you must have followed it, right from the Firefox blocking the cookies in 2019, Safari blocking it in 2020. In 2021, we had the iOS 14 and ITP 2.0 update from Apple. And now with 2023, Google trying to take away the third-party cookies. So see the means and the possibilities that the digital ecosystem allowed us before is just going to be is just shrinking, right, year after year. And along with that, this data protection regime that a country would put in will make it even more harder and stricter. So it's important that we understand the implication of this, but at the same time, understand how to work around keeping in mind these limitations and restrictions. One is restrictions from the tech companies, and one is the restrictions from the government or the regulatory bodies in the country. And and not just that, right? The consumers also have their opinion. And to, I think Anand also mentioned this in McKinsey's report, and I also had this one done in April 2022, but the markets is US. But I would say this is pretty much the same everywhere, right? One third of the customer believes that the companies are currently using their data responsibly. That means two-thirds of them have a neutral opinion, of which 42% say the companies are not using it responsibly, right? Which is a quite huge number, right? Because as we saw from your own feedback, or as you said that you would not give a consent unless it's clear to you, or if it depends, or some, most of them said no, right? Because that's the first thought that comes into your mind, that companies are not using the data responsibly. And there's obviously nobody can be blamed for this, because we have experiences, we've our own experiences maybe, or we have read about what's happening in the world, right? Because one of the closest example would be let me skip this slide and come to this. One of the and I can, you must have seen this in Netflix, The Great Hack and the Social Dilemma, right? And after seeing this, or maybe you may have read this about the US presidential elections, or the Facebook selling your data for the purpose of the presidential election, or Facebook or Instagram kind of on a real time understanding what are you doing, where are you going, and accordingly trying to kind of send you those relevant messages. But at the same time, it's scary that they know that they're tracking you. They know where you're standing, they know where you're sitting, they know who you're seeing. All of this is a bit of a when these things come out, obviously the first impression of public would also always be to give no to such consent, right? And I think there was this term that was coined at the time, and I really kind of it kind of really made sense to me, and it kind of said surveillance capitalism, right? Which is what we are in at the moment, right? Because we look around anywhere, right? We've been tracked. We've been asking questions, and a lot of the technologies do know what we're doing. But that's the world we're living in, right? And this allows, this is the mindset, right? Uh, this is what is making this particular slide even more important, right? Because what happens when the data gets into the hands of, that gets into the wrong hands, right? A government a data breach at a government agency can cost millions of money for the government, right? I remember I think it was the Russian hack that had happened in Germany on all the banks. So there was a classic example where when the data was leaked into the hand of the hackers, and all the banks in Germany were shut, all the servers were shut because all the servers were hacked. And it kind of is such a it's such a scary thing to know that when the data gets leaked, you don't really know what follows after, right? And then the question is, should I really have shared my data? Because if I hadn't shared, this wouldn't have happened, or at least I would have been safe. A breach at a corporation can put proprietary data in the hands of a competitor, which is what you don't want. A breach at a school can put students' PII, personal identify information, in the hands of criminals who could commit identity theft. And access of audience data by technology companies may compromise personal information for their own benefit. A classic example of this was, I think it was last year, where Google in France used personal information to kind of give personalized ads, because in GDPR you're not supposed to collect PIIs, which is personal identifiable informations. And sometimes what Google does is they collect it through the URLs. So for example, you are on a URL, even if you have given a consent saying that, no, you don't want Google to know your geographical location, but Google can still track it through your URL because the URL can capture your geographical location. And the PIIs were collected. When I say PIIs, your email address, your telephone number, sometimes even the credit card information, like in the US, can be collected if you have linked your credit card to any of your Google accounts and all this stuff. In India, see that we may not have happened yet, but now we're talking about Google Pay, Amazon Pay. The payment system is so advanced in India. Without a personal data protection, there could be many consequences that we can think about. But hopefully, nothing has happened so far. But it had happened in France, and then Google had to pay at least 200 million euros as a fine. Because what what GDPR says is, if any company violates the GDPR rules, they have to pay 6% of their annual turnover as a fine. And that's a huge money for Google. 6% of the annual turnover is a huge money, right? So those are the things that is also affecting the companies, but at the same time, the companies are still going ahead and taking that risk because they want to kind of make sure that the system is running, right? Customer expects to be recognized and want their experience to be personalized. So even if you're talking about privacy being such an important question, even if you're talking about, we are asking a question on top of a question, if like the privacy, can we confirm that privacy can really be guaranteed? There is another version of it where the consumers are expecting personalization to happen. We've seen this in the case even now, right? Most of you said no for the privacy, but a lot of you have said yes for personalized experiences. So that's the expectation. More than 50% would consider sharing if they think that there is a benefit that they're getting from it. But the question is, how do you represent that privacy? The question is, how do you make consumer believe that you would actually take, when I say you, the brands would take care of that data and would give them equal benefit or recognition and make sure that their data is not jeopardized, right? How do you do that, right? How do you get the trust from the consumers? And the consumers being so skeptical, trust is something very, let's say, a question that that is difficult to answer, because that trust is not so easy to get, right? We'll see that in this in the coming question. So having said this, right? Remember, I mentioned about the two sides of the same coin. Now I'll flip how things can become, right? So we're talking about privacy being such an important thing. The question is, what comes first, right? We need to make sure that our privacy is intact before we do the personalization, right? Because it's not a question of seeing a personalized ad, but it's a question of, when I'm seeing a personalized ad, I must be sure that I shared the data because I trust the brand. And I think that is a balancing act. And that takes time. And that is a process. And that is something that needs to be done over a period of time. So what this means is, the impact of this is, the personalization is going to be difficult and harder in the future, or even now, right? Because when we do personalization, we should make sure that our privacy has been made sure of. We have a very good data protection act, or we're following a data protection act, or we have a data ethics framework in place that goes in hand, where that allows us to do the personalization that is much healthier and trustable for the consumers. That being said, now, as I said, how do we get that trust, right? How do we make sure that the consumers are are giving us the rights to kind of use their data? There are three, let's say, principles that ideally can help you to at least do a starting step as a brand, right? One is to make sure that your consumer protection is the key, right? Because the more consumers feel protected, the more willingly they would be to share the data. Obviously, along with what recognition they would get, right? Because the first um, impression for any consumer, as we saw in McKinsey's response or that survey, is that they won't believe unless they see transparency coming across end to end from the brand. And that being said, the personalization is a factor of the quality of data that gets collected. So data is the currency of any kind of personalization, right? It's a coin that gets termed so far, right? Data is the new oil or the data is the new soil. Like, I mean, data is important. Consumer data is really, really, really important. And it is the currency for any kind of personalization, because in the privacy conscious world, what we need to find is this balancing act between the need for tailored marketing messages and respecting consumer privacy. Now, it is not as easy as it is said, right? It's a quite complex process. It is a quite difficult process to set up, therefore to follow, and it is over a period of time that you actually get this balance correct. But having the principles laid down, but having the principles agreed in the organization, I think it's a good starting step. And these are some of the principles that you can actually think about and put it across, like put it down as your documented data protection policies, or let's say DPA, as many agencies would have now in European Union. um, um, all the agencies, right from Group M to WPP, have their versions of DPA that needs to be signed with every publishers, that needs to be signed with every client before we start working on digital campaigns. So that actually says that what are the principles that we follow, what is the core belief as the agency or the brand that we think about. Transparency in data management, right? The third and the last principle. And actually, these are the three takeaways from these the slides that I mentioned to you. Is that if you follow these three principles as a starting step, I think it's a good way to look into how to get the balancing act, right? Because you lay this down in your company's policy, making sure that it is aligned with the government's policy as well. Then I think it's a good starting step to first clear the privacy box in place before we start thinking about personalization, because it cannot be started at the same time so that you can take care of both. You have to start with the privacy, because that's where a lot of work and system goes in place, right? Now, as I said, there is no one solution to this problem, or there's no one size fits to all solution. There are certain considerations that you can think about, and one of it, what I will show you now. But there are many other things that you will see that in India, maybe specifically, it will evolve once the PDP is released and you have a separate data protection and bill in place. Data protection policies in place. There will be several considerations that will coming at that time. At the moment, in European Union, this is most of the companies that follow, that a lot of them have the data relationship management program, right? Now, it's not about the program, but it is about what goes into the program, right? It is about how simply, how explicitly words carry the message to the consumers, right? Starting with data invitation, right? That as soon as anybody gets onto the website, or this is obviously not the consent. Obviously, consent is in terms of essential tracking cookies, but this is more about once you start. Let's say, for example, you are a loyal customer of a brand. You open your own loyalty card account. At that time, this data relationship program comes into place, right? So it starts with data invitation, which goes and sits in the data security center, which is the heart of this particular program. data value proposition. So exactly what is the consumers getting in return for the data, the data that they're sharing, and the dialogue. Like over a time, customer may change their mind, right? Because consumers are skeptical, as I said, and trust is not something that they can just give on to brand with one or two interaction. There could be chances that they may change their mind about giving the access to data. So reminding and refreshing the value exchange is a critical part of the relationship. So like a constant dialogue, and it shouldn't be like the data is once shared that there's no conversation with the brand and the consumer, because that may think that the purpose is met, and hence more important. And then the user control, right, which is a very important thing um, in the user control thing. And it's also um, let's say you can say that it's also a situation where you would also lose a lot of control, because when you say user control, it means the user can anytime go into the app and say, I don't want to share any more details, and that's it, you cannot share it, which is what Apple iOS allows you to do. Because if you give the consent now, and you can go back and change the consent, there are many brands in Europe that have come up with the app, um, um, that come up with the app, and the app gives the authority to track the consumer, but you can always go back and switch it off, right? So giving that level of flexibility to the customer can bring a lot of trust into the brand, because that would say that, okay, they are not just collecting data as soon as I log in, but they're collecting data because I gave them the consent, but I can always revoke the consent if I think I'm not comfortable, right? So it's about giving that transparency in the user control. So four things, right? One, data invitation, data security center, data value proposition, and data dialogue. There are certain key things that you need to keep in mind when delivering this data relationship, which is people, process, and technology. So it's not just about technology, but it starts with people. It starts with the process that you follow, and then it comes to the technology that you use to do this, right? Data invitation is basically really important and starting step for valuable personalized experience, because it's about making sure that you're omni-channel and you leverage that omni-channel approach to send the data invite out, make the invitation to customer to share their data highly visible, explicit, and personalized. It's about how simplified you kind of make the invitation. Use the layman's language and layman terms that anybody can understand. Use pre-prompts to make their decisions. What that pre-prompt means is that before they give the consent, just push the message again saying that, giving this consent would mean that be able to track, will be used to show personalized ad. That kind of gives a reminder for them that before they say yes, this is what it kind of leads to. So again, giving consumers more belief and transparency that, oh great, so this is what it means, and this is what would allow the brands to do before I take that step, right? And I think that is what is important to understand, that in this whole data relationship program, which currently runs in Europe, I can say a lot of the brands have been able to collect this in a good manner. There's a one classic example for Mars, pet nutrition. So Mars, as you know, is confectionaries and chocolates that they're known for, and they're huge. Their market share is good. They launched the pet nutrition department, right? Obviously the vertical, and obviously pet nutrition, you have big brands like Pedigree and all of them being so massive, it was difficult for them to have loyal customers. So they came up with this app, and through app and identity mapping, they were able to have a solid, strong first party data. And in that first party data, what they did was making sure that they have this data relationship program intact, for making sure this first party data was being able to gather more numbers over a period of 1 and 2 years. And the reason they were able to get a considerable number of first party data is because of the data relationship program, because it put the control in the hands of the consumer straight. So it's not just about making sure that your privacy is taken and agreed and understood, but it's about making sure that the power sits in the hands of the consumer. And that kind of gave them a more freedom to go and give their data to Mars, and thereby Mars using that for a lot of advanced data management and data deliverables or activation. But at the bottom line, or the, let's say, what is the three things or the important things to keep in mind is to respond quickly to the evolving world of regulations around customer data by just prioritizing the technical side of data management will be a mistake, right? Just because a regulation has come in place, you just prioritize the technical side of the data and not look into the human side of it would be a huge mistake. So make sure that whenever the PDP comes in place, you're humanizing the PDP along with making sure that you're also regulated or you're consensual to the country as well. While it is pivotal, while it is vital to find and invest in the right technical measures, a sustainable data strategy and also needs to have a strong human focus, right? So one is about the regulation, one is about the data being protected, but at the same time, it's also about what is the sustainable data strategy that you are setting up using that available data that you have, and how are you going to make sure that your data is increasing over a period of time and with a strong human focus, right? So to personalize, it's important that you go down to the level of understanding the consumers, speaking to them in the layman terms, so that that connection with the human with the consumers are met, and thereby you get the data, and then there is a transparency or the trust being created. We must seek to generate trust by building a transparent, permission-based relationship with customers that has a strong value proposition. And that is what the data relationship management program that I was talking about. It is not a solution that can solve all the problem, but it is a solution that at least starts in the step of getting the trust from the consumer, because that's where it starts, right? And that is something very difficult to get, and that's something that can change in a day's time or a week's time or a month's time, and it's even easier to lose the consumers. So it's important to how you frame up this relationship and make sure that that relationship is maintained, so that the loyalty is built up.
Sanup, I think Suresh had a question, and his question was actually was something playing on
Sure.
everybody's mind that at the end of the day, how will companies be able to really compete? Let's say the Personal Data Protection Act happens in India, and it is as stringent or strict as how will companies then compete rather, because they're betting hugely on customer data, right?
Correct. That's a good question. So that's exactly what I said at the start, right? The questions are the conundrum just extends. The question is, even if the privacy is even if the consensus from the consumers are there, is it really a private world, or if you're really trying to keep it private, or and what about the competition as well? So very similar question, and a simple answer to that is it's not, it will be difficult obviously with the competition space, but what you can do is to make sure that how transparent you use this PDP regulations, and make sure that your data protection agreement that you put out for yourself or your partners to start working on the data that you collect is much open and understandable by the anybody in the digital space. So even when in the European Union, when the GDPR came in place, the initial 1 year is all a test and learn approach, right? The DPA, the data protection, the data protection agreement was going changes after changes in that 1 year, keeping what the regulators have asked us to do, that keeping the same, but how to make the data or how to collect the data and how to make sure that we are collecting more data than our competitors had to go a lot of changes and test and learn, because at the end it's not about how you compete with your competitors for at that stage. The starting step is to make sure that how transparent you actually set the policies for your consumers. And you're right, the competitions will also do the same, but at some point or the conversation starts with how you simplify your data protection agreement for the consumers, and that is different because everybody can use different languages, and it's all about how you actually gain over a period of time. So there's no one simple answer for that, Suresh, but it's basically once the PDP comes in place, it is a starting step to make sure that the DPA that your company will adopt will have to kind of make sure that it goes over a period of changes, making sure that everything is taken into consideration. Because, like I said, just because the regulations have come in place, don't just prioritize the technical side of data management. That you go into the data management and make sure that everything is consensual or is making sure is within the PDP. Because uh, neglect the human side of it, because that will be a mistake. What you need to do is basically make sure that the human side of it is also taken into consideration.
Now, the
So I'm
second
sorry, I
question
don't
that
have
is,
one
yeah,
answer fits to all.
no, that's fair. I think it's not a simple topic for sure. I think it depends on the contours of the act. The other question that came up
Yeah.
was, what commercial tools or available tools can you recommend for companies when to deploy this data privacy life cycle that you actually talked about? So, are there any specific tools or any specific technology companies that you would recommend?
Yes, I can. I can maybe send you a couple of, but as there are many companies that in the European Union that have also originated just because the GDPR came in place, and some of them are European Union specific, but some of them are not. I can send a couple of the names, don't have it in top of mind, but there are many companies who are expert in this field, and who can help to set this commercial tools and policies in place. Now, if at the end, right, what it needs to happen is that any partners that you work with, right, be it Google as your, let's say, your analytics partner, be it Adobe, or be it Salesforce as your CRM partner, all of them will have to then adopt this data privacy agreement or sign a DPA with your company, and that DPA can be put in place by these the companies. I can send you a couple of names, but I think the ones that GroupM had used, completely forgot them. In the European Union was quite popular, which is what was very strong in the Europe as well. I don't remember in the top of my head. It's been long now, but I can send you a couple of the names that can be useful. I'm not sure if they'll be used in India at the moment, but I'm sure at the time the PDP comes in place, a lot of these companies will put their hands into the country to make sure that that is formed at that time.
So I think as a follow-up, we'll be obviously sharing the video of this recording on our platform, and we'll make sure that we also put in the name of the names of the companies. But typically, are these what consultancies, or they are also technology providers? How do they work?
So they are, I think all the big, yeah, one good point to make is that even companies like Accentures and Deloitte and all of them have started their respective services in Europe to deliver on this specifically, like to start with consultancy, but also able to set up the DPR in place. Some of them are legal companies, but I guess these companies are also putting and their hands into this space and deliver these as a service. So I think at least Capgemini and Accenture have started doing that in Europe.
Okay.
But a lot of companies are local, as I said, in Europe. In Germany, there are many law firms who have actually switched to become DPR agencies.
Ah, okay. The third question that came up was this is an interesting one about employee data. So the question was that since PII and mail documents, what happens when an employee leaves an organization? Like for example, in Europe, can the employee ask the company to delete that information? Is that considered as personal data, employee data?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, what happens in Europe? What happens in Germany today? Because it's like there's one GDPR policy, right? But every country have their own versions of the GDPR. So it takes the main form of the GDPR, but it also adds their own version of things. Like, for example, the GDPR rule in Ireland is much or is not as stringent as what is it in Germany and France. France has the stringent GDPR policy. So one is the GDPR, what is commonly used in European Union, but along with that, France have many other restrictions that they've put in place, and that's why Google got fined for that particular purpose, because what Google did was illegal in France, but was legal in Ireland, for example.
So the
From
question
a
is,
common
does
GDPR.
GDPR extend itself to, is it only relevant to customer data, or does it also extend to employees? For example, in DHL Express, does GDPR apply to you as employees in terms of your data being protected, and can you ask the company to delete the data when you leave?
Yeah, so I was just coming to that. So the version of the GDPR is that it's not just for, so yes, it protects the consumer's data, but ideally it consumers the citizens' data. So yes, it includes the employment data as well. So the data that I share with my company, the company is supposed to delete it even from the system when I leave the company. And that needs to be proved back to the company, to the government bodies, that this person has left, and therefore this is the proof that we've deleted it from our system.
Right. I would say though, Sandeep, I mean,
So for
Sandeep's question was also, part of his question was related to mail docs. But from what I understand,
yeah,
mail and documents that an employee sends within a company which are related to the business of the company is not PII.
it's not PII. No, they're not PIIs. Yeah, PIIs are basically what you kind of share in the digital space, not the company email box or anything, but something that you kind of set up in a, let's say, your Google password. I'm sure you've heard about single sign-ons, right? Like single sign-ons is you use your Gmail ID and then you
Sorry, Sanup, I think we're losing your voice a bit.
use that Gmail ID to sign in different platforms, right? Your name, your. Sorry, do you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So what I meant to say was that PIIs are basically what you share in the digital ecosystem. So it could be anything. So for example, it's a single sign-on, right? You may have a Gmail ID, and you will use that Gmail ID to log in into Facebook or LinkedIn, and you keep that as one ID. But when you create a Gmail ID, you may have filled the Google sign-in page, right, in which you may have shared certain informations. That is what, if anybody tries to pull that information, those are PIIs.
Okay. Outstanding. I think you can go ahead. We're at 8:25, so we want to wrap up the presentation, and we can keep taking questions. But if
I
you have
think
any
that
questions
was
out
my
there,
last slide.
oh, awesome.
Yeah,
Any other
that
questions,
was my
folks?
last.
I know it's late, but if anybody has any questions, would love to hear from you. You can just put your question on the
Yeah,
chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask Sanup directly. That's fine. Any follow-up questions
any
also
question,
from?
it not necessarily have to be question, but it could also be your point of view, which is what I mentioned before, that there's no one answer to this. You could have your version of the story, which is what will be interesting for me to learn, but I'll be happy to have that discussion or take a question.
Sumesh, you had a question on tokenization.
No, I was asking the startups, right? So all of the startups or new gen startups are selling their metrics is sometimes the consumer data, right? Like I have this many consumers, so this is my growth strategy. So for more of a P&L per se, they are showing this as the metrics. So that will also change. Is it?
That will also change, yes, because the way they collect that information today is that they run a survey, right? So for example, companies like Nielsen or Kantar or any of these big companies, they run focus group interviews, they run surveys, they run different sorts of surveys, and in that survey, in the past,
You
they
mean the
used to
market
deploy
research?
cookies. Correct, market research, exactly. The way that is conducted will change once the personal data protection
Sorry, I
comes
think
in
so.
place.
Yeah.
And that has, like, for example, in your the type of questions changed, the frequency of the survey changed, a lot of these things changes.
So I would say, Suresh, the truth is yes, while startups depend upon first party data, but the truth is that, technically, I mean, they would never, at least, okay, are they just collecting data to sell and monetize the data? Yes, there are certainly companies who are doing that. I think the fact is that any regulation which comes in will potentially put a complete stop to that. So I think for companies where collecting data and monetizing data is their, let's say, core of their business, I think those companies will see the largest amount of pressure coming out of the Data Protection Act. However, any startup which is in a business line where they are collecting customer data as part of their business to service the customer better, to, let's say, deliver products to the customer's home, you're actually collecting the customer's phone number, their email ID, their residential address. I think those companies will have to really tighten the ship in terms of how they store and manage data. And I think consent potentially will become very critical for them as well if they want to continue servicing customers. So,
Right.
in a way, if your platform is a great platform and customers love coming there and they love the experience of your product or service, then the chances of them giving you consent is higher. So, I think the other flip side of it is that if you want to get data from your customer, you'll also have to ensure that your product, in a way, deserves the data that they're sharing with you.
So I was just thinking a hypothetical situation, like for example, a Netflix knows what kind of movies I like, so it can characterize something, right? Something from it. So that is little more personal, or like it can come, it can in the future it can go bottom line creepy, like it knows most of our behaviors. So I was thinking on that line.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
see,
go ahead, go ahead.
the one thing that the one thing, Suresh, the flip side or the good side of any data protection act is the fact that what the government is trying to say is that don't focus on the name and the details of the people. In fact, focus on what is the need and the behavior and the context of the people and deliver the message on that matter. So don't actually go behind email IDs, but go behind what that person is actually wanting to achieve. So if you see in the digital ecosystem in the past when the digital started, right, it was all about behavioral, contextual intent and all of that. But the moment cookies started coming in, all the conversation flipped to email IDs. And the more email IDs we get, the better it is, because then we can start look-aliking, we can duplicate the people like that and go behind many more who have those things. But with the your example of Netflix, right? That also is that the Netflix will be able to do a lot of these things because that's their data, right? But what they would do is that instead of looking at your email address, they will start looking at like what exactly you mentioned, or what they're currently doing, what sort of movie you like, what is your taste, what is your genre, any new movies releasing, putting them into your favorite list, and all of those things, because that's where the focus is shifting. And that is what the regulators is asking Google, Facebook, or any internal, let's say, media companies to say that focus on the behavioral interest or contextual side of the people rather than looking at the email addresses or personal information.
Okay.
Hmm. Anybody else has a question? You can unmute yourself and ask Sanup directly, or you can put it on chat. Okay, great. I think we don't have any Sanup. So firstly, thank you so much for being here. I think really interesting times
Thank
ahead,
you so
and
much.
I think over the next 1 or 2 years, India will see through clamping down on hopefully protecting consumer data, and it'll be an interesting time
Yeah,
for businesses and how they compete, given the fact that data is so critical and central to businesses today. Thank you
yeah,
everyone for
yeah, yeah.
being here and staying on so late, and we hope to see you
Thank you
soon
so
on our
much.
next
Thank you,
session.
everyone.
Take care.
Yeah, take
Okay,
care.
good night.